to see everyone. And it's really great that these meetings are being led so brilliantly by Matt and others, and thank you for doing that. So I'm going to talk about the impact that COVID has had on research, and what essentially I want to just try and present a few ideas or a bit of a summary of where I think we've got to over the last 12, 14 months. Then have a discussion really about what we want to keep and what we don't, because I think research, like everything else to do with COVID, it's had some really amazing stuff come out of it as a result of the pandemic, and then there's been some casualties, and I think it would be really interesting to talk about your perspectives on this, because many of the people on this call are people whose research has suffered as a result of COVID disrupting the plans that we had made pre-pandemic. And many of you have adapted amazingly to that. But, you know, it'd be interesting to hear your perspectives on this as well. So the usual frustration of the aspirant academic. Okay, so this is my life. This is Matt's life. This is Colin's life. You have an idea, you have your light bulb moment, and you talk about it. You sort of have a little conflab with colleagues. Then you start writing. You start writing your grant application or your proposal or whatever it might be. And then you sit and you wait and you wait and you wait for the reviewers to come back to you and tell us what they think. And then you get really terrible reviews. And so with fired up with anger, you start writing again. And eventually, and sometimes it feels like it's just that your time has come, as opposed to the grant is any better than the one that you wrote the previous 14 times. You get lucky and you get some money and you get to get going. The thing about getting a grant is that you then actually have to do the work after that, and that's the really hard bit. Although it feels like getting the grant is the very, very steep bit of the hill. There's unfortunately it's like going up a hill where you then find a corner and there's an even steeper bit. So you need to, first of all, you need to pull together your team. You need to go through ethics, R&D approvals, and all those sorts of things if you're doing clinical research. You need to get through your fair share of trials and tribulations in terms of actually delivering the trial. And then again, you come to the period where you are writing up and furiously trying to convince somebody that this research is groundbreaking. And that's the bit that then starts to get really frustrating. I've already met with LJ, with Matt this morning, to talk about some of the work that he's writing up at the moment. You've all been at this stage, we're about to approach it. This is the peer review process. There are lots of different ways to describe it. But essentially it does feel a bit like you send your manuscript that you've nurtured and loved for, you know, years and years and years off to be judged by 2 or 3 people that are doing it in their spare time, in a hurry, in between looking after kids, writing their own grants, doing their own clinical work and all the rest of it. And then eventually you come across the third reviewer who that's his approach or her approach is no, I don't think so. But eventually you might actually get your paper published. And this isn't to put people off, but one of the processes that I've been through, which covers that entire landscape, was the SNAP2 EPIC study that most of you will know of, and some of you will have been participants in, or, you know, contributors to, and thank you for that. But I first had the idea for that study in 2013, submitted one grant which got rejected, submitted another one which got accepted, you know, got some funding, very, very modest funding in 2015. We did the study in 2017, and where the first paper came out in 2018, and we're still writing papers on it now in 2021. So, you know, that's good and bad. You recently, Peace Odor submitted and published a paper in the BMJ, which was a really fantastic meta-analysis of interventions to reduce post-operative pulmonary complications. That was a year in the peer review process. So from the time that he first submitted it to the BMJ, it was a year until it was published. So, and he didn't dawdle on on his responses to the peer reviewers, but it was just back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So yeah, it can be a bit of a challenge. Now, so if you try and summarize all of that, you know, maybe idea to grant award 1 to 2 years if you're lucky, delivering a trial 2 to 3 years again if you're lucky, and then writing up and publishing another year or two. So that was historically the way that we did business. Then this little fella came along and the whole world has changed. So what's been good? This is a good thing. And this is a good thing for so many different reasons. So it's a great thing because we've, the community and the scientists behind the AstraZeneca vaccine, and indeed the Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech and all the other vaccines that have been developed around the world, have gone from discovering this new virus in January of 2020 to having vaccines that work and that are going to, if we can get the distribution of them right, that are going to materially change the pandemic within a year. And it's absolutely astonishing. And the other thing that's great about this that you'll all recognise is the as far as I understand it anyway, the commercial approach that's been taken by AstraZeneca, insofar as they are manufacturing this without the ambition of making a profit, at least during this phase of the pandemic, so that in principle, the vaccine should be available to poorer countries without it being a massive sort of profit-making initiative. But of course, as we've all heard and we all recognise, it's not just about cost, it's about distribution, it's about high-income countries behaving fairly, and we've got a long way to go on that yet. Now, what's clear is that this is years of work that's been compounded into a few months. So some of you might have read in the press in the last couple of days that finally a malaria vaccine has hit the threshold that's been set of having 75% efficacy. And efficacy is an important word. So 75% efficacy means it's effective in the trial setting as opposed to effective, which means that's its effectiveness in the sort of normal clinical setting. So 75% efficacy of a malaria vaccine, but malaria has been around for donkey's years and vaccine development in malaria has been around for just as long. So how have we got so far with the COVID vaccine development and all the other treatments in a few months? So pace and urgency, clearly, you know, everybody recognised that this was a virus that was going to stop us in our tracks in every way, shape and form, both from a public health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So governments got behind this work to try and contain the pandemic because they had to from an economic perspective as well as from a public health perspective. And what that led to was this completely unique collective focus. So while malaria in the years gone past, HIV, still today, diarrheal illnesses, and for example, they're all massive infective killers worldwide, have been for many, many years. But they in general compete against cancer and heart disease and trauma and all the other diseases and conditions for research funding, for the attention of academics and for the attention of governments. Whereas COVID changed all of that. Everybody was suddenly focused on COVID. And so that led to two things. So the first thing is it meant that all resources were diverted, pretty much all resources were diverted to this single cause. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But the second thing is that we all worked in an unparalleled way. You know, I think we all probably have felt that we work pretty hard. We're all, you know, clinicians, we've all studied for and passed lots of exams, all these sorts of things. We probably work at least as hard as any of our peers of our age group. But I'm pretty sure that we've all worked harder in the last 15 months. I know I certainly have. And that intensity of work, I think, is unparalleled and not necessarily healthy, but was required. The other thing about the vaccines, of course, is that they weren't developed in a year. The underpinning science behind the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, and in fact, all of them, I'm sure, has been around for some time. And they've been waiting and waiting and waiting for the right disease to come along, essentially, to then ultimately develop the vaccine against. So it's not that it happened overnight in a year. It's just that they developed the technology, they funded the startup company, they'd done all of that stuff, and then they waited for their opportunity. And that's certainly the case with some of these trials, although not others. So Remap Cap, for example, and Isaric. So Remap Cap is the ITU platform randomized trial. Isaric is the observational study that's given us so much epidemiological data about COVID. Both of these were set up years in advance. So Remap Cap was set up to treat viral epidemics of flu, and Isaric was set up to, again, to characterize viral epidemics of any nature. Everybody thought we were going to get another flu of some sort, and then coronavirus came along. But the basic infrastructure for both Remap Cap and Isaric have existed for some years, since the swine flu pandemic of 2009. Recovery was the exception, as I learned only a couple of weeks ago from reading about this in the newspapers. But that was something that came about really as a result of a collision of very clever people, Peter Horby, Martin Landray, who were brought together by hugely influential people, i.e. Jeremy Farrow of the Wellcome Trust, to develop this platform to evaluate COVID therapies. And goodness me, hasn't it been effective? Now, we know that for those that want to write or study or develop treatments against COVID, it's been a hugely productive year. So these are from the first phase of the pandemic as it appeared to us, so the spring of last year, the proportion of the numbers of papers that were produced in that time, it's really colossal. If you think about normally, to just get a paper from an idea to writing, even if you've got a data set ready to go to analyze, like, for example, those of you that are examining PQIP and NIAA data have access to that data that's already been collected, but even then it takes months to analyze normally. And this is a new disease that have produced this number of papers in 5-6 months. Other things that have been really astonishing about COVID is the level of public engagement. So because this is a disease that has affected absolutely everybody, either directly or indirectly, because of either relatives and friends being affected by the disease itself or the impact of lockdowns and other social measures, everybody's interested in it. So public engagement in this disease has been amazing. And there have been both good and bad examples. So bad examples over there on the left, better examples over there on the right. People that we know who have not previously, in the case of Charlotte and Rupert, had a big sort of public profile in terms of supporting the public understanding of science, that have really come into their own, and much respect to them. And the collective focus is the key thing. Now, you will probably all be aware that when COVID or when SARS-CoV-2, when we realised how big a deal it was going to be, the NIHR set up this urgent public health categorisation. So basically what it meant was that two things. So first of all non-essential research was stopped. And the second was that if you wanted your study to continue, it was either going to fit into the UPH category, urgent public health category, or it wasn't. And urgent public health trials really were focused directly on COVID. So it was things like recovery, Remap Cap, and so on, and not much else. And what I think is interesting about this is it was a bit like in the NHS. It was taking the research infrastructure that we have in the NHS and turning it into a sort of command and control structure, where right at the top, the CMOs, so Chris Whitty and co, were making the decisions about which trials fitted into the UPH category, and everything else just fell by the wayside. So that therefore means that there were casualties. And as I said at the beginning, many of us, I count myself in this, have been, from an academic perspective, casualties of the pandemic. So if you look at the NIHR portfolio, which is the list of studies that the NIHR has designated as being of high enough quality to merit support from research nurses through their clinical research network, there were just over 6,000 studies on the portfolio last year. And by October, so first wave over, period of stability over the summer and early autumn in most parts of the country, and still less than 50% of the studies that had been running pre-pandemic were open to recruitment, and open to recruitment at all. And of those, only half, so 22% in total, were actually recruiting. So of the studies that I'm involved with, PQIP and CASAP both continue to recruit, but in very, very small numbers. And the randomized trial of the Little Journey virtual reality app developed by Chris Evans stopped recruitment, and we're only just now restarting. So that's 15 months after the beginning of the pandemic. And again, that's not due to lack of trying, it's just lack of capacity, either of the chief investigators like me, or more usually the troops on the ground that have to do the work, because research nurses were pulled back into clinical work, you know, and all the other reasons that you're aware of. There were also fewer non-COVID patients in hospital, with all elective work stopping for periods of time, fewer resources to share, redeployment of staff, and all those sorts of bits and pieces. And this wasn't solely a UK problem. So this is a slightly difficult graph to interpret, but essentially it shows you by country in bands from up to down the change in the number of patients recruited to studies, and you can see that it's all on the wrong end. So in China and Japan, there were more patients recruited to studies during the COVID era, and that was probably related to COVID itself, and relatively fewer recruitment to normal studies, as it were, overall. But in every other part of the world, the number of patients recruited into studies dramatically fell. What have been the other casualties? The impact of the pandemic on women scientists has been written about quite a lot, and I slightly object to this characterization, because I suspect that it's not as much about women researchers as it is about researchers with childcare responsibilities, whether they're male or female. But nonetheless, the writing has been largely about the impact that it's had on female academics. The fact that during lockdown, they were on the whole more likely to be responsible for childcare when children were kept at home, and that's had a very significant impact on their productivity, and also, as you see at the bottom there, women are more likely to be in short-term or casual contracts, and therefore were more likely to lose their jobs as a result of the pandemic. So quite a big impact there. And if you, this is another way of looking at it, the proportion of women amongst the authors of papers, if you look at 2019 in the grey bar at the top, versus, so it's about 35% of papers had women authors, and then the COVID-19 papers, a smaller proportion of those papers had female authors at all. So lots of circumstantial evidence that this has had a disproportionate impact on women academics. And this was a report that was published just at the beginning of the pandemic, so the worst possible timing really for it to have an impact, but that I was involved with, which highlighted the issues that there are with equality, diversity and inclusion in academic anaesthesia, full stop. And there was a whole bunch of recommendations that came out of that, and one of my jobs for this year is to sort of bring this back up to the top of people's list of things to think about and try and get some of the actions implemented. But academic anaesthesia and academia per se are both not necessarily very friendly environments for people with childcare responsibilities, and for women specifically. And those problems, much like lots of different things in COVID, have been amplified by the pandemic. Having said earlier that there was a lot of patient engagement or public engagement with the pandemic, people interested in finding out about the science and so on, another casualty, in my view, has been patient and public involvement in actual research design and implementation. So those of you who've tried to submit grants will recognise that all grant reviewing bodies now expect patient and public involvement in the development of a study, the design of it, the implementation of it, the interpretation of the results, and the dissemination of the findings. and yet because of the pace with which research was developed and implemented as a result of the pandemic, that was one of the things that massively fell by the wayside, and that I expect is a huge loss and something that we don't want to continue. And then we probably need to take a step back and have a think about some of the stuff that might have been good that's come out of it. So one of the things that I think we all noticed is the sort of rise of the preprint, and the fact that in normal circumstances, particularly if you've got some findings that you think are particularly interesting or novel, you kind of keep close, tight control over them, and then you submit it to the peer review process, and then that takes forever, as I've articulated already, and it takes ages for the data to actually get into the public domain and have an influence on practice or policy. And that was something that massively changed, whether relatively minor small studies through to the big sort of recovery type papers, they were all published in preprint form, or the results were released by press release before papers were even written. And that really divided opinion. Those of you who are on the ITU Consultants WhatsApp group will recognize, some very esteemed academics on that group really quite cross about the fact that we were seeing loads of really important data coming out by press release before anybody had an opportunity to either peer review or in any way scrutinize the findings. And they then immediately went on to influence policy. And I was involved in some of those discussions where we took basic findings from the trials which hadn't been peer reviewed, and then immediately wrote a policy about it, so that we, in the case of drugs that were found to be of benefit, like dexamethasone, remdesivir, and tocilizumab, IL-6 inhibitors, they could get to patients as quickly as possible. So the implications of this are really quite profound. One of the things that I'd be interested to find out is what proportion of the papers that are published on preprint websites like this one then went on to be published in peer-reviewed journals, and how long does it take? Were the results materially different, and does it matter if the results are out there for the world to see? What does this mean for the peer review process and the open publishing movement? I think lots of us are frustrated by the peer review process. I do peer reviews and I'm terrible at it because it's always the bottom of my to-do list. So I take too long. It must be frustrating for the authors, and it's expensive. We don't get paid. The peer reviewers don't get paid, but it costs our time when we could be doing other things. And so what does all of this mean for the open publishing movement? And how can we potentially retain the benefits of this while ensuring that we don't drop scientific quality? Now, of course, preprints and rapid publication have not necessarily always been a good thing. We've seen some very high profile retractions. So this in the Lancet, the paper about hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine, which was purported to be an analysis of a multinational registry called Surgisphere. And this paper, published in the New England Journal by the same group, analysing the same database, looking at ACE inhibitors and antihypertensive agents and mortality in COVID. So the two probably biggest medical journals in the world published papers from this database, and it was, as far as we can tell, fictitious data. And probably the reason why it got through their normal processes is because they cast aside most of their normal scrutiny and processes in order to try and get the papers published quickly, because they thought it would benefit patients. And then retractions came afterwards when people started to really kind of scrutinize what was going on. So that's kind of been a whistle-stop tour of what has happened. And what I want to do is now, in the last couple of minutes, before I open this for discussion, just sort of summarize what I think's happened, and then pose to you the challenge of what we want to keep and what we want to leave. So these are the things that I think have been bad about COVID for research. Top of my list is work-life balance. I'd worked quite hard to address my work-life balance pre-pandemic, and it all went out the window at the beginning of March last year. And I'm still trying to get that back, and I expect that many of you are in that same position. While it's meant that everyone has been hugely productive in the last year, if you're clinical or academic or whatever, it may have meant you're very productive, but on the other hand, it's not necessarily sustainable, and that's a bad thing. And that challenge then amplifies historical problems that we've had with equity as far as gender or sex are concerned, equity for people who've got kids or other caring responsibilities, and all those sorts of things. The lack of patient and public involvement with research design and delivery, I think, is another challenge, and something that I think that we don't want that to continue. We want patient and public involvement with how we do stuff. I think lab challenges have been clearly a massive issue. There were months that people couldn't work in a lab environment because of lockdowns, and that's been a big problem with research delivery. And under-resourcing of research due to redeployment of staff. So clinical staff doing more clinical work, research staff going back into clinical work, and so on and so forth. And then finally, this sort of relentless focus on one topic, the topic of COVID-19. While it has meant that we've got the treatments and we've got the interventions that we think work, there have been a lot of other casualties. And I think a bit like the health service itself, I don't know how we could have done it any differently, but I think we all recognise that prioritising COVID care over non-COVID care, while I can't see anything that we could have done differently, we now know that there's a massive, there's a backlog of work to do, clinical work to do, and the impact on patient outcomes and on patient health as a result of not receiving treatment, not going for treatment and so on, is going to be very substantial, and potentially much more substantial than the impact of COVID itself. Good things, remote working on conferencing. These meetings are much better attended than they ever were when we just ran them face to face, and I hope that's a good thing. And I think that is a really positive thing for people with caring responsibilities and children and all the rest of it. The public engagement with science, I think it's a really good thing that the public have engaged so wholeheartedly with COVID and trying to find out more about it and understanding the disease. The red tape that we have to go through to get studies done, it was there, but it was massively accelerated. And I think so the accelerated regulatory approvals process and the common sense approach to ethics and R&D approvals, which I've really witnessed since COVID as a result of trying to make my non-COVID studies COVID safe. So for example, removing the need for face-to-face consent, sort of cutting out bits of it that meant any sort of face-to-face interaction that with patients, between research staff and patients, that wasn't necessary could go. We've had very accelerated progress through ethical approvals processes for all those things, and that's a really, really good thing. The bits that I'm undecided about, and I'd be keen to hear your views on, is the prioritisation of research. So this command and control thing, this focus on one topic at the exclusion of all others. I'd be very interested to hear your views on it. On one hand, it's meant that we're closer to beating COVID than we might have been otherwise, but the impact that it's had on cancer research and everything else is really bad. The rapid publication, open science, non-peer-reviewed thing, very interested to hear your views on that. And I think a couple of things that I haven't mentioned, but are really important to this group as well. The pandemic has had a massive impact on charities, as you will probably have heard of just through the lay press. And the knock-on impact that that's having on research funding is very profound. So the amount of money that's available to fund non-COVID research in the future is going to be dramatically diminished. And that's going to have a big impact on the type of research that we all do, which is not COVID related. And then the second bit is the way in which you guys have had to adapt, those of you that are doing PhDs and MDs and research fellowships at the moment, to move away from what you'd hoped that you would be doing at the start of your fellowships to adapting to that world. And I think Amira was on the call earlier, and your project, Amira, has dramatically changed, and you've been massively adaptable, and all credit to you and your supervisors for enabling that to happen. But it's it's a very significant challenge. So wrapping up. So like so many other things, I think the impact of COVID on research has been both good and bad. I think like everything else to do with COVID, we've seen a massive sort of acceleration of innovation and collaboration, which is something to celebrate. And we've got to grab all of that and keep what we want to and ditch the rest. And I'll come back to the things that I think are particularly useful to talk about in a sec. And again, it's just an opportunity for me to say thank you to each and every one of you and everyone else for everything that you've done for patients and for research and for each other over the last 14, 15 months. It's been a very difficult year, but we are hopefully seeing some sunshine and coming out of it soon. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to